Snow went on falling long after the ravens had settled into their perches, as if the sky had forgotten any life but the steady labor of dropping pale feathers upon the world. The wall swallowed it without remark. On its sheer face, the flakes turned to a silvery dust that disappeared into wind-sculpted grooves, then streaked away in little drifts that hissed along the stones. At times, the cloud bank would thin and a swatch of dim stars would show, a chill net cast over the emptiness. Then the wind would rise and scour even that to nothing. John had been hours in the rookery, because there was a comfort to be found among wings and the soft murmur of beaks busy with grain. Warmth, too, of a sort, more honest than any heat coaxed from old coals on a stingy night. The rookery had a smell that never went away, not in summer, not even after bath days, and it followed him out. Feather dust and guano, the sour iron of old blood, straw, lamp oil, rat musk, big as the sky on bad days, manageable on good ones. He had written and rewritten the letter 3 times, though he would not send it. The parchment lay folded in his glove, a waste. He could not send it, not to Winterfell, where the words would come as a stone thrown into a full basin, ripples all the way to the rim and over. The last of the ravens blinked at him and tucked its head beneath a wing. John fed it a pinch of barley anyway, because there are courtesies meant for men and there are courtesies meant for birds, and both deserve keeping. Ghost waited at the door, a white wedge with eyes like 2 coals, silent and intractable. The direwolf's breath fogged the air between them in slow blossoms. When John reached down, Ghost leaned briefly against his hand, just enough to remind him of warmth without asking it. They went out into the open, where the courtyard had been rendered into a series of rare islands by wind, each island a hump of hard-packed snow, separated by channels scoured down to the uneven gravel. A single lantern tilted from a hook by the armory stair, an old thing with a cracked pane that let the flame jitter as if it were thinking more than a flame ought. He did not mean to find the cask. He meant a walk to push the restless hum out of his muscles, then a bench by the smithy hearth, where he could pretend the heat found him before sleep did. But he found himself drifting along the inner palisade, following Ghost's unhurried pace. The direwolf's head kept lifting, ears pricking, as if at some tone John could not overhear. When they reached the eastmost corner, where a little shed leaned into the base of the wall like a child learning to stand, Ghost stopped entirely. The shed was used, when it was used, to hold ruins waiting to be carted away. A wheel with a broken rim, a barrel with its staves sprung, a ladder too gone with rot for even a harmless duty. The door stuck fast until John leaned his shoulder against it and forced the wedge free. His breath became smoke in the thin, stale air. The shed had just enough room to refuse a man's shoulders, and John turned sideways to get in. Took his eyes a moment to find the shape. The cask was taller than his knee, an old sailor's thing with the iron bands gone brown-red and furred with a fuzz like frost. In the light that crept around him from the courtyard, it looked newer than it was, simply because the snow had not found its top. There were letters burned into the lid, not in any hand he knew. They might have been a name or a mood or a prayer. When he leaned closer, he could feel a whisper of air come up from the crack between lid and hoop, warmer than the shed and carrying a dry scent like slate in summer. He should have fetched a man older and wiser, if only to have the right one tell him not to trouble himself with old things tucked away out of sight. He did not. The lid had a ring welded on. He slid his fingers through, braced his knees, and pried it up. Inside, something glowed, the faintest ember, a sort of argument the darkness was having with itself. John did not move for a moment because it felt as if he stood on a boundary, 1 foot on each side. He rubbed his knuckles against each other to confirm he was still in his meat. Ghost had his forepaws on the threshold. He made no sound, but his ears had gone flat. The object within the cask was the size of a helmet and as smooth as river ice. It lay on a cushion of shredded straw and something that might have been fleece long ago. Its surface drank what little light there was and gave it back as a slow-bred warmth. He reached down, because men do foolish things for reasons that would sound wise in some other life, and his glove rasped on it. Even through leather he felt the steadiness of it. No tremor, no throb, just the truth of a stone. He carried it because once he had put his hands on it, Leaving it seemed more terrible than taking it. The cask was heavy in an honest way. The object was heavy in a way that sharpened his breath and marked his arms with a patient ache. He carried it to the old storage chamber near the kitchens where the heat of ovens seeped through in winter, which made it a favorite place to take his boots off and nurse the pain in his toes. He sat on his bedroll and set the object on the flagstones where the warmth of the room could reach it without insult. Ghost circled it once and decided against a second look. He was still sitting there when the dawn touched its pale gray edge to the world outside the arrow slit. The stone, or egg or idol thing, had not changed, not in any way a man would defend in front of a maester. But something in the air felt arranged around it. When he rose and laced his boots, he was careful not to nudge it with his toe. He wrapped his letter in a rag and thrust it into the deepest pocket of his cloak. He went to the kitchens and ate oat porridge that tasted like wet plaster and a heel of black bread that might have been older than some of the boys. When he returned, Maester A. Eamon was waiting in his cell, his blind eyes turned toward the door, his head cocked a little to one side, as if he were listening to the sound of John's shadow. "You were not in your bed," Eamon said, after Ghost padded in and lay down with his enormous muzzle on John's foot. "Ghost came to find me, or perhaps I could not tell one white shape from another. It is a handsome confusion to have." John told him what he had found. He did not play at ignorance or make jokes to chase away the strangeness. He said cask and letters and warm slate, and he waited for Eamon to tell him what it was. The old man's hands were as thin as he remembered a bird's leg, with the skin pulled taut over the little bones. He reached, and John guided his hand until his fingertips found the stone. Eamon exhaled, not a sigh, more a long, polite recognition. "Old things," Eamon said, and his mouth's corners lifted slightly. "The world loses them at a pace we prefer, and then someone brings one into a room where a hot meal has been eaten. I had a cousin, once, who kept old figs wrapped in wool. He would carry one in his pocket and feel it all day to remind himself that sweetness still existed. Is this?" John began, and then stopped because the word he had been ready to utter reminded him of a girl across the sea, and he felt foolish for half believing any rumor carried that far on other men's air. Eamon traced the object's curve. "An egg," he said, "of a bird that does not sing." "They are stone," John said, a memory leaving his tongue before he had a chance to measure it. "Stone eggs. Stone is a word we use for what we cannot wake," Eamon said, almost gently. "There are casks everywhere men have stacked things they were not ready to talk about. You have opened one of them. What should I do?" "Warm it," Eamon said, as if the answer contained its own mockery. "Men put old hopes by a hearth and see whether they turn. We are not complicated creatures at our core. Warmth and the attention of a living mind are tricks we have used for thousands of years. If all we mean to do is keep someone from freezing to death, the tricks are enough. If we mean more, the tricks look like what they are." He turned his head slowly, as if scanning a room with the one sense that had never betrayed him. "You will not tell the Lord Commander," he said at last, "because you do not yet know whether it is a secret or a story. You will fail to hide it from him even if you mean to try. Secrets leak out in this place with the meltwater." John left the old man and went about his duties as if the day were any other. He scraped bowls and shoveled out privies, insulted and was insulted by the same boys he had woken with for months. He took stock of his anger and found it nowhere to hand. It had gone to sit beside the warmth of the object on his floor. In the afternoon, when he supposed the kitchens had cooled enough to be decent to stand, he returned. He brought the brazier closer and fed it fresh charcoal. He rested his palm on the egg's curve until it stopped pretending to be entirely separate from him. He slept against the wall and dreamt of a black river divided 3 ways, each branch eating its share of the moon, and something swimming just beneath the skin of the water with its eyes shut. Most dreams slipped through him like sand through a sieve. This one clung. He did not tell Sam. He did not tell PYP or Gren or the Lord Commander. He told Ghost because a man could put his mouth near a beast's ear and say any foolish thing and know he would not be made to hear it back. He told Ghost he could feel a door under his palm sometimes, flat and unadorned, a door without a latch beneath his hand when he touched the egg. He told Ghost he imagined what might come through if it were pulled open. Ghost huffed and pushed his cold nose into Jon's wrist, and Jon stroked the direwolf's ears until his own breath slowed. Outside, ravens came with their little bits of the world. Joffrey had taken his crown and the iron chair with the posture of a boy wearing his father's boots. Eddard Stark had been named traitor and tucked away in a tower with a guard outside the door, who had not been told what treason was and could not define it but held his spear anyway because it kept a shape to the day. Robb Stark was on the march with more wolves at his back than any southern lord could count. Lord Tywin Lannister had summoned his many banners and built camps along the forks of the Trident until the riverbanks looked like a market gathering. Smoke everywhere you looked, noise, meat being butchered with speed and without any feeling for the animal. Strangers named each other loudly across camp lanes with titles and family words, as if such sounds would make better bedfellows of men who did not care to sleep together. If the egg had meant to stay only a warm, foolish secret, the ravens would not have kept coming. He did not see it open. He woke in the dark with Ghost's weight across his legs and the smell of burning hair in the air. It was not the worst smell, not the noisome choking of a stable fire, not the nausea of flesh. It was a sharp, pure thread, as thin as a new crack in ice. He lifted himself on his elbows and looked. The brazier had burned low, but the metal still held a dull red. The egg had split as neatly as if a smith had found the center and cleaved it with a practiced hand. The creature that crouched in the wreckage did not act like a creature newly made. It turned its head and looked at him, and in the movement there was a confidence that made the room feel small. He had seen dragons before of a kind, the carved ones that flanked the King's Gate in Winterfell's old tales, the paintings in a book Sam had held with both hands as if he feared the men on the page would crawl out and ask him for food. He had never seen a real one. The hatchling scales were dark, not like soot but like river stones when you first lift them and they are wet, and you can see the many colors in the black. Between each scale the skin gleamed with a faint blue sheen. When it opened its mouth, the inside was the color of a ripe plum. It was not as large as his forearm. Its wings were translucent around the edges, a membrane stretched like thin parchment, threaded with veins as delicate as fern stems. It hissed, a sound as ordinary as water on iron, and it made the hair along his arms stand up as if a storm had come close. Ghost rose, not in any hurry, and stood over the hatchling. They examined one another without any pretense. It would have been a clever verse for a bard, ice and fire smelling each other's breath. But the truth of it was that both were animals first. Ghost's lips pulled back slightly, polite as a man in a hall, just enough to show there were teeth if teeth were needed. The dragon, Jon could not help the word now, bowed its head almost imperceptibly, then lifted it again and stepped forward. It rested one small claw on Ghost's wide paw, as if to steady itself, and closed its eyes for an instant. Ghost stood the wait. "Hello then," Jon said. The hatchling tilted its head. Jon extended his hand, and it sniffed his fingers and made a low choke of a sound, which in a man might have been the start of a laugh. It did not bite. The warmth coming off it was a steady heat, like a banked oven. He thought of the kitchens again and the hard men moving bread with long paddles because no one desired to touch such liveliness directly. He thought of Aemon, and how the old man would reach for the creature's little skull with equal reverence. And so began the keeping of a thing the world had laid to sleep. He fed it bits of meat pinched between his fingers and did not bother to wash the blood away before he rubbed its head. It slept in the brazier once the charcoal had gone gray, ignoring the ash as if it were silk. In the mornings he found in the ash the little hollow where its body had been, the edges collapsed inward, still warm enough to make his face tingle when he put his cheek to it. He cleaned the hollows with a strip of linen and said nothing to anyone. That first week, the little dragon made a crying noise when he left him alone and a purring sound when he came back, though the purr had in it a rasp that warned where true comfort did not lie. Aemon knew, of course. He tilted his head in the hall as Jon passed, and later, alone with him, said, "There is a different cadence to your step. A man who walks while carrying a mirror learns to spare it from jostling, lest he see some moment he is not ready for." When John finally brought the hatchling to him in the folds of his cloak, Eamon held out his hands and laughed, a soft, crackling sound like the settling of wood after a fire. "I had thought I would never hold a small wonder again," he said. "What name have you made?" "I did not want to," John said, startling himself with the truth of it. "Naming feels like a promise. I have made enough for a lifetime." "One can name without owning," Eamon said, sober again. "One can name to honor. Sometimes a fool names to pretend he knows something. But the creature does not listen. You might as well call the snow by another word and ask it to fall differently." The hatchling did not so much as blink while the two of them talked. It held its head up proud as any lordling, and the little teeth in its jaw looked like grains of salt caught on the lip of a blade. John touched his forefinger to its brow. "Rimefire," he said. The word felt like the clack of a lock turned. The dragon lifted his wings and shivered, as if it had been waiting for that. "I suppose there will be others," Eamon said, something like a joke but without meanness. "Names beget names the way warmth begets more fire." It did not stay small for long. The growth was not a ladder, a step at a time. It was a series of surges, each followed by a quiet rest where John would convince himself, foolishly, that this was the size Rimefire had intended all along. He learned new weights with his arms. He learned to sew leather and twist rope well enough that his fingers bled in secret, because a hatchling will sit on your shoulder while you muck out stalls, but a small drake will slide off at the worst possible moment unless a man has thought through the logistics of sudden living things. He learned, he thought he knew it before but he had not, that a living flame eats. He killed rabbits and then goats without the elaborate rituals of excuse boys make for themselves, because he had no time for stories. He watched the dragon's eye while it swallowed. He saw calculation there. He had no illusions about what kind of thing had come to lie at his feet. There was love in him, certainly, more than he had room for, more than would be useful. But there was also a new, sharp respect for the enormous distance remaining between them. The dragon did not know him in any way men know each other, by shared foods or words. The dragon knew him as a fixed point, a warm rock on which to lay, a smell to find. If that strangeness hurt him, it also freed him. When Lord Commander Mormont saw, he did not rage as John had supposed. His face went stony. He stood in the doorway, filled it with the certainty of a man who had been asked to hold line after line long past the point where his arms should have failed, and he looked at the dragon. The little creature, the not-so-little. By then it was as long as John's torso and 3 times as certain of itself, had made no effort to hide. It lay on the rug with its belly against the boards, its head raised enough to show it was not cowering, its tail wrapped around its own forelegs in a neat arrangement. Its eye moved to look at the Lord Commander. It did not hiss. Its nostrils steamed in the cold, tiny twin banners of warm air. "Close the door," Mormont said, and when John had, he said, "I am too old to pretend to be surprised anymore. If this is my failure, I will claim it, because that is what a man must do if he means to keep his house in order. Tell me how it came to you, not because I will punish you, but because I would like to hold the facts in my hand while they are still soft." John told him. He told him without embroidery, and the Lord Commander listened without the kind of interruption boys learn to fear. The "did you think" or "what did you think" or "were you thinking at all?" When John had finished, Mormont went to the table and poured himself a finger of spirit. He did not offer John any. That would have been too much of a kindness. "This thing is an answer to a question I did not know I'd asked," he said, and drank. "It will draw eyes. Where eyes go, the talk will follow, and after talk come knives. Men will arrive who have the habit of command. They will not ask permission to enter the room. They will expect to be obeyed because that is the way their world is built. I am the Lord Commander north of the neck only so long as the kingdoms continue to pretend this is true. If they find a reason to stop pretending," he shrugged. The motion was small and catastrophic. "This creature is a bell rung in the fog." "There are ravens," John said, as if that counted for anything. "There are always ravens," Mormont said, and this time he smiled like a man remembering the taste of an old drink. "There were ravens when I was a boy. There were ravens when my father put a sword in my hand that I could not lift. There will be ravens when the men who come to take your dragon have died of being old and tired of counting the silver on their floors. He set the cup down slowly and leaned both hands on the table. We will not send a bird south about this. If the south means to learn of it, they can learn from their own spies and their own bad weather. He did not order the little beast killed, and the relief felt like something John had been refusing to breathe for a week. He had not let himself consider the words aloud, but of course he must have known. Of course he must have. "Feed it," Mormont said, and the word had the weight of a vow. "Keep it out of the rookery. If it gets into the rookery, there will be a fight. If there is a fight, I will side with the birds, because the birds can fetch me messages and the dragon cannot. Teach it to come to your hand. If you cannot teach it, make it believe it wants to. I will not have men in this place burned because a boy's pet grew bored. Do you understand me?" John understood him perfectly. That night, for no good reason, he put both hands on Rhymefire's shoulders and pressed his forehead to the little skull, and the dragon gave a low, grating sound that might have been content if content were a knife laid gently against a man's throat. The first time Rhymefire took the air, he did so without permission, which seems only fair. John had been working with Sam to stitch leather panels for what Sam refused to call a saddle. "A harness," Sam insisted, as if the word itself could resist destiny, and he had left the dragon on the ledge outside the chamber. He went in to fetch a hole punch, and when he came back the ledge was empty and Ghost was standing with one forepaw on the stone and one in nothing at all, looking down with a stillness that meant precisely, "I am counting, and I do not like the number I get." Rhymefire was perhaps 20 feet off the ground, which, for a creature that had not flown 2 breaths earlier, looked like the height of a god's thought. He beat his wings like a boy hating the river while he learns to swim, and then he found the rhythm, if not the joy, and he rose in a crooked way, touching the air with each second as if it were a new stone in a stream. John could not speak. He did not call. He stood very still, hands limp at his sides, as if any gesture would heavy the air and pull the creature down. Rhymefire climbed above the courtyard, above the crenellations of the wall. He made a small sound, not a shriek, not a trumpeting, more like a yawn turned inside out. He tipped one wing and slid along the curve of the wall as if reading the word it made, and then he folded himself and dropped like a thrown knife. John's heart came out of him and hung there, a ridiculous ornament, and he was halfway to the grotesque prayer that a boy makes when he is about to see the worst thing he has ever seen. Then Rhymefire opened his wings again smartly, shook his head as if he had splashed water in his eye, and landed with a stumble and a rattle of claws that set everyone in the courtyard swearing with the automatic piety of men who fear they will be made to work. Later Sam would screw up his courage and say, "He is beautiful," and John would say, "He is," and neither one of them would add how holy it felt to stand beneath a thing that chose to look at you and decided not to end you. He learned to ride in the way of boys who have always expected to fall. He did fall once. It happened over the inner yard one late afternoon when the light was flat and the snow had gone to a sheen as treacherous as a lie. Rhymefire climbed and turned and John leaned too much into the turn, trusting to a single strap that bit his thigh. The leather held just enough to arrhythmia his balance. He came away cleanly, as if someone had plucked him up by the shoulders and set him down in the air. He had enough time to think the old phrase affectionately. So this is it, and then he hit the snow and it hit him back and he could not breathe. Ghost was there when he could stand again, pacing in outrage at physics. Rhymefire landed and raked a long groove in the snow with his talons, furious with the ground. John went to him and put his head against that hard brow, the way he had as a boy put his head against the stallion he had ridden until the beast's patience had worn thin. "We'll learn," he said, and if he was talking to himself as much as to the dragon did not seem to mind. By then the ravens had brought the other news. The news that sits across a man's breathin'. Gee, like another man, heavy, eyes close to yours. Eddard Stark had lost his head on a platform built for justice, because justice means what the man with the sword says it means. The letter John had written but never sent became a grave good. He put it into the brazier and held it down with iron until it refused the old shape and became black curls and finally nothing. The heat against his face was the heat of any fire. He did not cry. He thought of how the arm at the end of the sword had swung, and how a body that had kissed his forehead as a small boy could be made into parts by someone he had not been taught to fear. He was not as good at prayer as some men, and in that moment he became worse. He meant to desert. He did not. In the quiet of the night, when men sleep like knotted ropes, Lord Commander Mormont came and sat on John's bed and said, "I would let you go if the world were simple. It isn't. Here is what we will say. I am sending you south to your brother. You are the messenger I trust because I am too old to leave and too proud to send a man I do not care for. You will tell him what the woods have told us of the things that move in them. Nothing for wine and songs, but enough for nightmares. And he will decide how he would like to see his children grow old. You will go because a good commander sometimes must throw even his own vows into the river and hope the water gives them back to him. You will take the beast with you because you cannot leave it here, and because if you do not make use of a miracle, you insult the God who made it." It was not a speech men put into the histories, but it was the kind of thing that keeps the world from cracking open. Sam made the harness sturdy. He called it a harness even at the end, when Rhymefire's shoulders had grown thick enough to require wide bands of leather cut from the sides of oxen and stitched with two awls working in concert. The ridges along the dragon's neck were not smooth like a horse's mane would have been. They were plates, each a small edifice. John learned to ride sitting low, his knees drawn up, his hands not on a pommel but on the ring where the neckpiece met the chest strap. They tried many knots and found one that did not jar anyone too much. They learned to respect where the dragon's wings met his body and to swear ritual insults at straps that seemed to find ways to twist themselves while unused. The night they left, there was no moon. John saddled Rhymefire by touch. He had expected the dragon to complain. He always complained when he did not see the straps coming, but the creature was quiet and watchful, as if hunger were something beyond meat. Ghost loped alongside until the stairs that cut into the ice where the shadow of the wall lay deepest. The dire wolf stood there and watched as John swung his leg over and settled his weight into the new arrangement of the world. John reached down and touched Ghost's head. It was not a promise. Promises are for the living. It was a thank you for the times when the direwolf had kept him from becoming less than he was, and for the times when the direwolf had refused to pretend not to see his faults. Then the dragon moved. The wall fell away from them like a dropped curtain. Flying at night is a prayer said by a man who has never been taught the words. The world is a bowl turned upside down. The stars are the holes the light pierces. The air has a taste, raw and metallic as a mouthful of snow scraped from iron. Rhymefire's wings beat with the heavy rhythm of a bellows. Each stroke opened a space in the night that John did not know existed. And in that space he had the brief thought that there might be a place where men could be clean from their brutalities. There was a freedom in it that tasted like a stolen drink. He learned, in the long miles that night, how to speak to the dragon without sound. He learned to tighten his knees and lean a hair's breadth and feel the creature acknowledge. He learned that if he brought his right hand away from the ring and rested it on the place where the wing's base flexed, Rhymefire would bank as if obeying a new law. He learned that if he pressed his palm against the beast's neck and thought hunger, the dragon would begin to drop, searching the dark for the silver movement of water that means fish. More than once he thought thirst and was confused when Rhymefire's body tightened as if preparing to leap. Thirst and the urge to fire were the same thing in the dragon. He understood that much. Fire is simply thirst that has found a throat. When the pale began to creep into the east, he and Rhymefire were over the wolf's wood, and there below, under the long spread of the trees, a herd of deer moved like a slow idea. He turned the dragon's head with his hand and they dropped low. The deer startled and scattered, and one leapt into the air in that manner they have sometimes when they encounter a god where there was supposed to be only grass. Rhymefire's body tightened along its length and then relaxed. John smelled it, smoke sweet as fruit, and in the corner of his vision he saw the briefest thread of pale flame, almost white at its heart, lick out from the dragon's mouth. It did not sound like roaring. It sounded like silk torn over a barrel. The flame met the deer and the deer went down. John swung his leg over and slid off and ran the last steps because in him there was still room for the old horror, that any animal might die without regard for its inherent dignity. He had his knife out before he knew what his hand had decided. He meant to make it neat, just as the men in the kitchens did with chickens when they were feeling like good men who lived in a world where skill mattered. He need not have bothered. The dragon took the deer in 3 movements, each almost delicate. When it was done, Rhymefire lifted his head and stared at the sun as if daring it to go on being. The neck in winter is a low nightmare of water and reeds and mist. It is 1,000 miles of no, where rubbed with priests' ashes. Men here make their beds in places they scold others for stepping on. John and Rhymefire did not fly much above it, because low air is warmer and the beast's muscles took less insult at that height. Once, in the course of a dreary afternoon, a flight of arrows rose from the reeds with the collective determination of a new idea, their heads bright as fish eyes. They fell short by a generous measure. John scanned the water skin and saw the ripple where they'd been. Some men with not enough food and too much pride, defending a patch of mud that belonged to God's first laugh. He did not blame them. He slept in a little hollows on islets when he could, and he took care to feed the dragon at dusk and not later because night fires can be seen. He did not make camp. The days had a pure fatigue to them that made everything simple, and in that simple he found a measure of salvation. He spoke to the dragon only when needed, and when Rhymefire slept he ran his hands along the creature's belly and sides to look for tears or bits of reed stuck where they might fester. He spoke to Ghost in his head, because habit is a rope a man can climb back up when the well is deep. He slept with the harness still strapped to the creature, on his side with one gloved hand wrapped in the reins, because it was easier that way to imagine they were both tethered to something sensible. On the 5th day the land opened and the air changed. The emptiness made room for men again, for the way men turn earth into stories and stories into banners that need carrying. Ahead was the Trident where 3 waters come to an agreement. He smelled it before he saw it, the wet of it and the fish and the human thing underneath that made him think of the market in White Harbor. Stall after stall of men leaning bruised fruit forward to tempt a coin. There were fires on both banks. There were black lines where roads lay under the thin crust of snow, and on those roads the slow procession of supply trains and sick men and stubborn men and anointed men all moving in each other's way, so that the best a general could hope for was mostly forward. He did not fly directly into it, because Rhymefire's strange heart wanted height, and because his own cowardly heart wanted a moment to recognize something before it compelled him to act. He circled north and watched the river's flanks. He saw, as expected, the lion's colors in more places than he liked to count. He saw burgundy and gold in richness and in rough copies, flags sewn by women making guesses by firelight. He saw the boar's crowned head over a tent city that filled a bend in the river with the glow of 50 cook fires. He saw freemen sleeping on their sides in makeshift lines, their backs to the wind and their feet toward a trench that would not do much when it needed to. And then he saw a wolf's banner, gray on white, hanging square as a decided jaw in the air above a concentration of order that made the rest look like children's games. Robb Stark's men did things the way the old men of Winterfell did things, without flourish, with everything in its place. He weighed both sights in his mind until they balanced as they should. He brought Rhymefire lower in a slow, wide glide, so that a boy on guard duty had time to rub his eyes and poke his fellow and make sure both saw the same thing. He set the dragon down at the far edge of the camp, on the hard ground between the pickets and the river, where the wet earth gave a little under Rhymefire's talons and yet held. It is hard to enter a camp quietly when you have brought a myth to dinner. Men came, not running exactly, but at a deliberate pace meant to suggest that civilians might run, boys might run, the superstitious might run, but men who had seen death exchanged nods and came, and then after they'd kept their pace, they ran. Spears bristled. A few archers drew and did not release. John slid his leg over and dropped to the ground, raised both hands palm up, and waited. Rhymefire lay down heavily and made a low sound that John felt in his teeth more than he heard. Robb came out of the press like a man stepping from a portrait. He had grown in ways that did not show in his height. He had a different center of gravity now, as if the muscles under the skin had learned where to go in a single winter. His hair had darkened just enough. His eyes were Eddard Stark's eyes, but there was something new in them that his father had only let out on certain days, an impatience with foolishness that had no place to rest. He stopped a few spear lengths away, His men watched him, not the dragon, because a leader is a mirror, and if he betrays nothing they must pretend to see nothing. He looked at John's face before he looked at all the rest of it. "Brother," John said, and the word did a thing to his mouth he had not anticipated, as if he had bitten into fruit and found it colder than it had any business being. Rob put his hand on John's shoulder. It was as if the rest of the men had been made of air and now were made of matter again. The noises came back. The dragon lifted his head and looked at Rob. Rob looked right back and did not blink. "Did you bring it, or did it bring you?" Rob asked finally, in a voice pitched to carry and yet not be foolish. "A bit of both," John said. They found a rope and a tent peg and attached Rimefire to the earth in the manner of men who know that sometimes the mere pretense of restraint is enough. It would not have held, but it gave the men watching some place to lay their worry. They fed John a bowl of stew that had too much carrot and too little meat and the taste of tin, and the cook stood and watched him eat as if John's appetite were a judgment upon him. He ate with gratitude all the same. Rob came and sat on a folding chair that belonged to somebody richer. They looked at the river. Men attempted to pretend not to stare at the dragon while they went on being important. "Mother will unite with us by nightfall," Rob said, which John knew must be a lie, a hope or a rumor, because the world did not bend that easily. "She is," with the phrase still finalizing, "and when she comes she will have fry men behind her, who will be useful whether or not they behave like men. I'd like to take the crossing while Tywin's men are still surprising themselves each dawn with the number of feet they have left. He has scorpions and engines for hurling. He has hired men who will pretend to be brave if they are watched. He has better armor than we do. He has a way of looking at a man that makes the man want to go home and count his coins. I have a plan and a bit of luck that looks at me like a stray dog." He glanced at Rimefire. "You've run off the hound." John told him briefly what the woods had told Mormont, and what Mormont had told him to tell, because a trust given is a torch and a man is dishonored if he blows it out. He said the cold was waking in the north in ways that made old men forget to laugh when they sat together. He said there were shapes, none of them had names, for that moved with a courtesy that did not belong to living things. He said plain words and let them hang between them. Rob's jaw tightened and eased by degrees, as if some part of him had not been surprised after all. "Good," Rob said. "Not the news, but that you are here. Good." He looked again at the dragon, and his mouth became a line that would satisfy a lord. "The lion will want to cross here tomorrow, if he is the man I have learned he is. He will rely upon his artillery to make a neat enough mess that our boys take a step back on their own and make the second step easier. He hopes we fear him, and we do. We will feign more. He will feel his cleverness like a weight in his own fist. That will keep him from seeing what's falling on him if there's something that can fall." "Is there?" John looked at the river. The current had a sulky, stubborn motion to it. He thought of boys trying to hold a piglet by the hind legs. He thought of Tywin Lannister's men in their neat ranks, the gray light marshalling off steel plates. He thought of the sound a dragon makes when it wants to alight, the faint groan of sinew like leather across a knife. "There is," he said. "But if I do it, I will have done it. There's no taking this back. I will not open my eyes tomorrow and find the Lannister banners unburned." "I can carry the cost," Rob said. "If you want a thing done and it is your brother who can do it, you do not speak to him like a priest. You use the language you taught each other before you learned to talk to men." They slept a little because men must. Rimefire slept with one wing extended in such a way that the men who passed had to detour around the translucent sail of it. Some brushed it with their hands when they believed themselves unseen. A few knelt and prayed and did not know that they had done so until they found their knees hurting when they stood. John lay on his back with his hands crossed loosely over his stomach and listened to the river. He did not imagine what he would do the next day because the imagining would be less certain than the doing, and he felt in his bones that he did not have room for anything less than certain. At first light, the Lannister camp was a wagon master's dream. It always was. That was one of the old lion's prides, the neatness of his lines and the efficiency with which wastes moved out and weapons moved in. The cooks had begun early. and the smell of onions carried over the flat water like a story about a better house. The engineers had stood at their machines with the grim hands of men who know numbers. They swung the arms of their engines in slow practice arcs. They measured distances like misers. They did not look at the sky because only fools looked up before a battle unless they were praying, and men in the employ of Tywin Lannister did not do much of that kind of prayer. The first scorpion bolt left the machine like a thought the world was not prepared to hear. It screamed a little and then found its voice and fell quiet. It arrived in their trench 20 paces shy of where it had been meant to go. Robb made an approving noise, the kind a man makes for a horse that could be better but understands the basic idea. "They will adjust for wind," he said to no one. It was close enough to the shape of a promise that the men around him shifted their feet and gripped their spear shafts higher, the way men will when their sinews tremble and they pretend it is in readiness rather than fear. Jon had saddled Rimefire before false dawn. He had warmed the reins in his hands and bent the leather to his will. He had cinched the straps with the calm of a man who does not wish to find himself dragged along the ground for half a mile. He had checked the scuts along the dragon's neck and brushed from them the little flakes of old skin that looked like blackened snow. He had spoken no words to anyone because words would be a waste then. He had climbed into the harness and settled his weight and felt the creature adjust itself to the minor insult. He had pressed his palm to the cool spot at the top of Rimefire's head, where the scales were smooth and thinner and he could feel a little of the animal beneath. He had thought of Eddard in the snow at Winterfell and how orders were given there without theater. He had thought of ghosts that were not ghosts. He had thought of nothing he would later have to confess. When he rose into the air, the men below him made one great noise, not a shout or a cry, but a sound like the inside of a bell being struck by a heavy hand. The lion's ranks stuck for a heartbeat, as if 100 men had put their feet into fresh tar. Then the engineers became priests, which is to say they believed too strongly in the excellence of their liturgy to notice an act of God when it came. The scorpion slewed, lumbering because machines are beasts that do not want to sweat. They attempted to find the angle they would prefer. The bolts went up and did the clever thing, which is to miss narrowly in a way that makes men feel they have not disgraced themselves. One sliced the air close enough to Jon that he saw the barbs as he tipped Rimefire into a dive. Men speak of Dragonfire as a single event. It is not. It has steps like a courtly dance. But if a man has only ever seen it once, he cannot know that. First there is the intake, the full-body draw as the creature makes space for more inside itself. Jon felt it under him, a bottomless breath. Then there is the knotting of the membranes along the beast's throat, tiny valves that arrange themselves into a new organ, one that exists only there and then. The sound it makes is different each time, sometimes a low chunking like a pump, sometimes a quick chirrup as if something were being coaxed. And then the heat gathers. The veins along Rimefire's neck swelled and darkened. He opened his mouth and the world's first fire crawled out, pale and roping and almost sweet-smelling. And then the air found it, and it became something men can speak of only by using the words they've hoarded. Jon directed the first pass at the carts. He was not a poet and so had little interest in the beautiful line of a burning man running. He wanted to break the spine of a beast too large to manage at full cry. The firelace touched tar, pitch, cloth, seasoned oak. It licked them with the experimental air one gives a bowl of stew, and then the carts rose into their own flavor of flame. Men shouted. Some shouted orders that had the correct shape but none of the expected contents. Some shouted names. Some did not shout because they had learned long ago that the mouth can betray a man more than any other part of him. Rimefire's second pass strafed along the line of scorpions. He did not aim to burn the men. Jon would have lied to himself about that had the truth been willing. But the machines were as tall as houses and men stood between their struts and along their frames, and there is no fire that leaps at wood and politely untangles itself from human skin when asked. A handsome man with a ridiculous feather at the back of his helm looked up in time to see his hair become part of the world in a new way. Jon could taste the hot copper bitterness of what came next. He grit his teeth. He turned Rimefire's head with his palm and set their line of flight along the edge of the pike's flame skated low. When it hit steel it went to steam instantly, A strange fog that carried with it the sharp stink of burnt oil and singed horse. A banner bent in a gust that had no name. It blackened at the edges and then curled in on itself like an old leaf on a frost morning. Tywin Lannister stood beneath a standard that had been measured by a man with an eye for cloth and an indifference to cost. He had risen at first light and broken bread with a cluster of officers, none of whom had found it easy to say anything interesting in his presence. He had wiped his fingers with slow care. He had settled his gauntlets on his hands with the practiced sternness of a man who knows there are always eyes. When the dragon rose and banked and fell, he did not move his feet. Men who had served him for 20 years would one day tell boys that the Lord of Casterly Rock looked up at a dragon and kept his boots in the earth and his jaw level. Not because he did not feel anything. It would be an insult to a man to say he had no fear. Fear is a sign of a functioning mind, but because he had made a ritual of never letting any man take the measure of him. He lifted his hand. Messengers ran. The order that moved along the line was simple: aim higher. The scorpions complied to the extent the engineers' trembling hands could make them. Rhymefire took a bolt then. It struck along the outer curve of his left wing with a noise like a wet flag snapping. The dragon rolled by instinct. The wing folded, recovered, beat twice out of rhythm. Jon felt the sting through the harness, felt the creature's flare of bewildered fury like a furnace door flung open. He spoke aloud without meaning to. "No," he said. "No." He bent his whole body the way one does in a small boat on a big wave, and the dragon found the right count again and evened out. Jon glanced under his arm. The bolt hung there, bright and hateful, then fell away, taking a ragged triangle of membrane with it. Rhymefire hissed in a way that said nothing and everything about his intention to answer. The fourth pass went for horses. It was cruel, but it was math. Cavalry needs horses more than it needs men. Jon directed Rhymefire in a long, shallow sweep that set fire to the outer row of the remount lines. The flame did not even have to touch them. It arrived close and convinced them they had been made to die of terror. Horses are honest creatures. They do not hold with that. They broke their ties. They dragged posts. They ran, and in running they took with them men who could not let go. They scrambled amongst the wagons and split the packed earth with their hooves. Already smoldering straw found air. Already fearing men found reasons to move in the wrong direction. A scorpion collapsed into itself when a team of 2 horses backed into it in a blind terror, the ropes snapping and curling like snakes. Jaime Lannister had the good fortune to be watching men at their worst when the dragon came. It fortified him oddly. He had expected boredom and was gifted a spectacle. He stood with his helm on his hip, hair too bright by half in the winter light, and watched his father stand like a man carved from the idea of a man. When the first blast of flame took the carts, he smiled despite himself. He had always been helpless in the face of clean technique. Later there would be songs, if any man would pay for them, and in those songs the dragon would be called Nightfall or Ironfire or some other thing. But in this moment Jaime found himself thinking, tidy. A tidy mind sits in the saddle of that beast. He recognized it because he owned his own kind of tidiness. He did not look up at the dragon's hanging weight and find a prayer. He looked for angles. He noticed where the sun would sit an hour from now. He imagined as best he could what it would feel like to be that creature, to be warm at the core of himself, to carry one's own spit of flame like a birthright. He thought of the men behind him who would step forward if he gave them orders in a certain voice, and he decided this was either the day he died or the day he did not, and neither outcome inclined him to write his mother a letter. "Guard the king," a voice near him said, and he laughed before he could stop himself, because no one had any idea where the king was in this mess, and if they did, the knowledge could only make everything worse. He pulled his helm on. He lifted his shield. The dragon's shadow fell over him then, a blur that made his eye think of swimming. For a beat, the world was gray, and in that gray he felt a child's awe. It embarrassed him. He put it away. Robb's men moved at the edge of Jon's sight like a hinge. They took one step back in good order, as if obeying the reason of the world rather than the madness of fear. The Lannister engineers, seeing the withdrawal they had wanted, shouted to one another with a relief so great it darkened the air. Their machines sighted. They fired. The bolts bit earth where men had been. John smiled the small, private smile of a hunter whose quarry steps exactly where the branches have been laid. He pulled Rimefire low, skimming the churned ground just out of the reach of the scorpion's arc, and sent the fire along the horizontal bellies of those engines. Flame eats up better than it eats down, the crews shouted. One leapt from his platform and fell badly. His legs tangled under him. He tried to stand and could not. John allowed himself the weakness of looking away. The river took men who fell into it like a stern uncle who does not intend to forgive but will not prosecute. It closed over them without ceremony. Steam rose where fire licked water. A wet fog crawled along the battle's edge, distorting what men thought they saw and making fools of their common sense. It was the fog that saved men who had no business on this earth, and the fog that swallowed others that had families back on their farms and a line of winter cabbages buried under straw against the frost. It is as it always is. The world does not measure worth on the same scale as the men within it. The last of the scorpions burned when its own braided rope caught and turned into a fuse. It went up all at once with a sound like the breath of a furnace. John could feel the heat on his teeth. He turned Rimefire and rose, if only to look down and assess the making they had done. It was bad work in the old sense, work that leaves a man's hands black and refuses to let him forget what he has put where it need not go. He had done what he had meant to do. The Lannister lines had lost their straightness. Their engineers' neatness had been given back to the world. Some men pressed forward toward the river's margin because forward was the last idea they had. Others turned toward a tree line that held no comfort. Others simply stood and waited, as if someone would come to them with a hand on their shoulder and say, "Now we are doing something else." Tywin Lannister looked up at the dragon one last time, not because he could do a single thing to change its mind, but because a man must look at the thing that is defending him if he is to talk later, as if he were there. Then he made a small gesture and his guard tightened around him and took him off that ground with the practiced efficiency of men who have drilled for this precise humiliation and called it honor every single time. He did not glance back. Men who owed him their lives, their freedom, and their children's marriages fell in behind him with a determination that would serve them well the rest of their days. He had lost, and he was a man who could count, and in his mind he was already setting out the number of steps necessary to make this loss into a rough advantage. John brought Rimefire down in a long, careful arc to the northern bank. He did not land among the tents. Men's tents burned too readily. He landed where a patch of old shingle showed through the snow, and the dragon's claws found purchase with a sound like a knife finding the seam in a chest. He slid off and staggered once, because the ground did not understand him properly after so much air. He found his legs. He tugged at the harness with his gloved hands and loosened the straps. Rimefire beat his wings once with a noise like a blanket snapped over a bed and then folded them neatly, as if the lesson had been imparted just this morning and he still remembered it. Men came and stopped at the line their own superstition drew. They murmured with the low awe that travels far and says very little. Robb came through them with his hair singed along one curl at his temple, as if he had bent too close to a fire to hear some foolish child. There was filth at his knee and a smear of something that might have been someone's breakfast on his sleeve. He looked at John as if measuring a new distance. "We will cross here," he said, not because the path was clear, but because the river speaks more plainly to men when it is told it has no choice. The Lannister right has gone gray. The left stinks of horse. The middle is a mess. We will make more of a mess, and then we will live with its smell. He put his hand out and John, surprised, took it. They stood hand in hand for a moment like boys on a frozen pond who have just agreed to jump, and then Robb squeezed John's fingers and let go. Rimefire lowered his head and moved it so that his eye was level with John's. John pressed his palm against that smooth spot again. He imagined showing the creature the picture of what they had done, not to ask for forgiveness or congratulations, but simply to be sure that both of them were in the same story. The dragon's breath curled around his wrist, warm as a promise made honestly. John closed his eyes for a moment and saw the river in darkness, and beneath it that swimmer with his eyes shut, moving against a current that did not care for his efforts. The battle did not end cleanly. They never do. It seeped out toward midday, and it left behind it objects that would offend the eye too long to speak of here. The fog lifted a little after noon and revealed the ragged edges of the work. Rob's men raised their voices in an ugly cheer that embarrassed them when they heard it in their own ears. They quieted themselves with the awkward dignity of men who remember their fathers are watching. The Lannister remnants did what their different loyalties taught them to do. Some went for the roads. Some went for the river. Some lay down and did not rise, because sometimes a man's body decides for him. By evening, the smoke had found a way to curl upon itself like script and rise in columns thick enough to make the sunset look dirty. Jon sat on a low stone with his hands resting heavy between his knees and watched the dragon nap. Rimefire's sides rose and fell like a pair of bellows, and sometimes his claws flexed as if gripping a branch in a dream. The creature's mouth hung open just enough to show the white peel of teeth within, grown in his sudden youth like mushrooms after rain. A clutch of lords came with their hats in their hands, ridiculous in their dignity, and asked Rob to step aside and speak to them. They used many words and few remarks of any use. They told him what he had done and what it would mean later. They advised him to hear theirs in his ears when he slept. Someone attempted to name Jon. He did not let them. Names are for the day when a man has enough time to argue about them. He did not. He let the words slide off him like sleet. He looked at his hands and studied how clean they looked. When night came for True, he went apart to the river's margin. Ghost came out of the fewer trees here, silent as the peace of night that breaks off and falls into your lap. The dire wolf leaned into him, and Jon pressed his face into the thick fur and let the smell of old leaves and cleaner snow fill his head until his nose ran and his eyes stung, and he felt again like a boy with frost in his brows and a very simple plan for the day. Across the water there were fires still, Lannister fires, a new camp set with less certitude. He imagined Tywin's mouth thin and unforgiving and decided not to make any speculation about what would happen next. Men who guess too far into the future confuse themselves and are disappointed for reasons they do not deserve. Behind him he heard the sound of a footstep that had learned its discretion from long practice. He did not turn. "You will be asked to choose," a voice said. It was Rob's mother's voice. It had the iron in it that good men are better for hearing once a week. Not between family and duty. That is a petty version of the test. Between one duty and another, the world will dress them in each other's clothes. You must not be fooled by the fit. "I have already chosen," Jon said. "You have begun," Catelyn said, plain as any winter morning when the sky is a slate refusing to be friendly. Beginnings are choices men pretend are accidents. Do not own it. Men will be easier to manage when you speak to them like a craftsman about his work. He said nothing. It was not brittle silence. It was the kind that can be set down and lifted again later without harm. "I do not know what to do with you," she added, and then surprised him by laughing softly, the laugh of a woman with cold in her lungs who does not pretend otherwise. "It is often easier when I do not." He found himself smiling into Ghost's fur. He did not let her see it. There was song that night. Men sang whether they had earned it or not, because singing answers a hunger no stew does. The tune traveled along the river like a lark. It rose into the air and did not turn to ash when it touched the smoke, and therefore it earned a place in Jon's memory as something useful. He slept not far from Rimefire, and when something woke him in the middle of the night, some rodent scrabble near the harness or some old lesson from a colder place settling, he lifted himself on his elbow and saw the dragon looking at him. The beast's eye in the light of the coals was not red or orange, but a sober black that reflected his own outline, tiny and perfect. "It will be worse before it is better," he told the picture. "And then it will be worse again. We will try to do the least harm with the damage we are bound to do." Rimefire's eyelids slid down and up. A small sigh worked through the creature, like the bellows emptying after a day of careful work. Jon lay back down. The ground pressed up hard against his shoulder and hip. By a little after midnight, the forges on the far bank had gone quiet, exhausted of breath. The Trident moved on regardless, patient and sated. In his dream, the swimmer opened his eyes. He was not alone in the water. Shapes moved with him, long as thoughts and older than words. If they meant him harm or good, the dream did not say. It left him there in the cold, making his strokes, and the river did not notice he was young.